What's up, guys? Welcome into the newest podcast from Capital Presence. This is Uncorked. We're going to go over our enterprise lessons that we've learned from over, I guess it's been about 15 years now in the industry supporting federal government and enterprise organizations. And so we decided to create a podcast that was a little different. We were like, how can we talk about the federal government and enterprise organizations and make it something that people might actually want to listen to instead of it just being like generic tech talk. So what I came about was this concept of Uncorked. And so what Uncorked is going to be is we are in my private cellar here where we're going to go over some of the bourbon that I have picked up along the bourbon trail. That today is actually Wild Turkey Kentucky Spirit, which is a 50.5 alcohol by volume, so it is a 101 proof. This was bottled March 20th of 2024. And so Kentucky Spirit is actually a collaboration between Wild Turkey and Matthew McConaughey, which I thought was very interesting. And so I naturally had to pick up a bottle while I was visiting the distillery last time I was there. And so the concept behind Uncorked is to enjoy a glass of bourbon or a glass of wine with you all as we have a conversation around enterprise organizations and businesses. How can we have an adult conversation without bourbon and wine, right? Or beer. Maybe we'll do a little bit of beer sometimes too, but the best conversations that I've had in talking about business involved a drink or a cigar, and we were just sitting around casually having a conversation. And I thought, well, let's put that into a podcast form. And so that is today's conversation. And you can't have the overall podcast without understanding a little bit about my background and Capital Presence background. And so I thought, why not do episode 1, Enterprise Lessons from Organizational Reorganization or Restructuring. And so, little backstory, I used to be a federal employee. I worked for the federal government for about 4 years at the Food and Drug Administration. This was during the Obama administration. So if you are familiar with the administration's work, you know that they did the Affordable Care Act was the big push from the Obama administration. Many nicknamed it Obamacare. But the Affordable Care Act, what it did was it put an emphasis on generics. And so the generics was a office at the time, the Office of Generic Drugs. And so the Affordable Care Act actually promoted the Office of Generic Drugs into what is referred to as a super office. And this promotion of the office required a reorganization, something that happens a lot during any administration. As goals change, the new administration comes in and they set their goals and initiatives, and so that promotes or amends the way that organizations are to go about their business. And so this was no different in the FDA, Human Health and Services, and the Office of Generic Drugs, where I was just happened to be the one who went through the reorganization. I was a member of Quality Management Services, and so I was on the team that helped produce SOPs. For those of you who are unaware of what an SOP is, it's a standing operating procedure, and this is how things get done within an organization. And so I was on the team that was responsible for the standard operating procedure writing, review. It was more so the interviewing of the subject matter experts, because I was actually in the chemistry department to start, and obviously I'm not a chemist. So you were either a chemist, you were a biologist, or you supported them in their drug review. There was something called GDUFA, which I'm going to mess up what GDUFA is all these years later. Generic Drug User Acceptance, maybe, is what it was. And what the GDUFA was a set of funding that was provided by pharmaceutical companies in order to process drug reviews faster so they can meet market demand and get to this new release that the Affordable Care Act was pushing. And so, mind you, I'm not a chemist, not a biologist. I had nothing to do with that except support their processes in getting that stuff done. So I was, like I said, I was a part of writing those SOPs, more so interviewing and putting those processes in place. And I learned a lot from that reorg, which we'll go over today. So I will go over what the reorg was, what went right, what went wrong, and then how you can learn those lessons. But first, we're going to pour some Wild Turkey. So this is the Kentucky Spirit, like I mentioned. It is a straight bourbon whiskey. And it's pretty good. As you can tell, I've had a little bit of it. So I'll just pour a small little pour. I have this, I'll put the bottle right there, which, by the way, this barrel that I'm using as for those of you who can see me on YouTube, the table stand that I have here, this barrel was provided me by a bar in Kentucky, in Louisville, called North of Bourbon, which is a great place. Met the owners there. I actually visited there May of 21. So it was the first May that they opened, and sat down. I actually got served by the owner, one of the original owners. Great guy. We got to talking, and then now it's become this thing that I actually go back. My wife and I go to the Kentucky Derby every year. It's been our pilgrimage. We've been the last 4 years. We were married on the Derby some years ago, and it's become like a tradition of ours to go back to the Derby. And then now a new tradition of ours is to go to North of Bourbon and sit down and have a glass of bourbon, and whether it be Pappy or Wild Turkey or Buffalo Trace or whatever. It's been a part of the process of our anniversary. And so North of Bourbon provided me this barrel last time I was up there. It is a Four Roses barrel, and it was a barrel that they had at a charity event that I guess they were a part of, and Four Roses donated it, and then somehow donated the bourbon, I would assume, and then somehow I ended up with the barrel. So that's pretty fun, and that's how it ended up in my basement. So cheers to Wild Turkey. Not bad. So let's get into the process of the reorganization. So I'll take you back to, I guess it was 2014. And so in 2014, a new director from commercial had been appointed, assigned, hired, whatever you want to call it, as the new director of the soon-to-be super office of the Office of Generic Drugs. And so the new director, he wanted to go through and put his own stamp, as many directors do, on the super office. And so what he started to do is he started to spin up offices, divisions, directorates, as to what he believed was his way of doing it and how he wanted to put his stamp. Now, he worked largely in a bubble. And so inside the bubble that he was creating, he was doing he was projecting what he believed would be his vision of the organization out. While there's nothing wrong with that for you directors out there who want to, or your business owners, or you CEOs who want to put a stamp, your stamp on the organization. Where he messed up, I'll say, is that he didn't have a group of individuals along with him that were able to help him articulate what the vision was. There was no real vision, and if there was a vision, it wasn't shared with quality management, which you would think that there would be at least one representative from the quality management systems team, which, by the way, the quality management system team was not an office. It was a team shoved under another directorate that made little sense. So it was a little bit of an afterthought as far as QMS was concerned, which caused a whole lot of trouble. Now, this reorganization, if you've ever been a part of a reorg within an organization, you understand that it doesn't go without hiccup. And people want to be involved. People want to have their fingerprints on it as well. And coming from commercial, this director really just wanted to do it himself. He wanted to push it out. He wanted to make sure that it was his vision that was articulated, and little other members had a say, or at least felt like they had a say. And so what this did is it led to pushback. And so this pushback actually prolonged the process of reorganization. He got frustrated with the red tape. And what happens when people get frustrated with red tape that come from commercial? They leave. He resigned. So I don't remember the exact amount of time that he was there. In fact, I have a book that's coming out And I think I put the dates that he was hired and when he left, but we actually sat in the same orientation. So we were part of the same exact new employee orientation, myself and this new director. And so people would ask me, what is he like? You know, you guys were doing orientation together. And, you know, he was a little quiet. He didn't really, I didn't know that he was actually in there until afterwards. I saw him speaking and then realized that he was actually the new director. They didn't make a big thing out of it. It didn't become like a stink or anything like that at the orientation, pointing out that he was going to be the new director, which was fine because you got a chance to talk to him or kind of see what he was like maybe when nobody knew who he was. So there wasn't as much of the pandering, I'll say. So seemed like a good guy, seemed like a very smart individual. It's just when people come from commercial into the federal government, they don't a lot of times get caught up in trying to push things through relatively quickly, which nothing happens fast in the federal government. Because there's red tape and SOPs in place for a reason to make sure that standards of operations is followed, but that can be hard for somebody coming outside. So that was the first mistake that he made, I believe, was trying to get something pushed through immediately without letting other people be a part of it. So take note, if you are looking to do a reorganization or you are looking to make a change, first bring others on board. That's my first lesson. Bring others on board. Even though it can be your mission, you want to make sure that other members are there to have a say. Any implementation is going to go a lot smoother, like this Kentucky Spirit. It will be Kentucky Spirit smooth if you allow others to be a part of the process. If you try to swim up current, it's going to be a struggle. So that's lesson number one. Bring other people in. It'll be smoother, Kentucky Spirit smooth, if you will, as you go through the implementation. The second one was that the rhyme or reason behind you do things needs to be documented. That's the second lesson. The second lesson here is document why you're doing something. Even if you don't really have a reason, document that. Because what happened after he left was that people were trying to make sense of this new org chart. People were going through the org chart, trying to understand why certain divisions were in certain places and how or why the directorates were in certain places and why certain areas oversaw other areas. And nobody really had an answer for it. And so when somebody resigns in the federal government, especially at the director level, there's a deputy director. And sometimes the deputy director does get promoted to director, but other times, because of the GS scale, they have to go on what's referred to as a detail. So it is a temporary assignment, which is what happened. We had a detail, which happened to be the deputy director, but she was detailed on a temporary assignment to be the director, and she took over this reorganization mess with little know-how or rhyme or reason as to why something had been done the way it had been done, which caused more problems, as you might imagine. So document why you're doing something. Even if you don't have a strict answer for why it was done, you just say, hey, I think this makes sense. That will help anyone coming thereafter. It'll help new employees. It'll help during the new employee orientation process. It'll help with future organization maps and standard operating procedures. And I feel like this was something that was pretty largely overlooked, was there was no rhyme or reason other than it was what his vision was. And it was kind of strong-armed, and it led to more headaches and more bumps and bruises along the way. The third and final lesson that I learned from my time and the reorganization is SOPs are important. So during the reorganization, and this is going to really kind of open up the rest of the show as we move forward, is the SOPs that we were creating set out as to what the Office of Generic Drugs, the new super office, was going to be responsible for and how they were going to do things. See, a lot of the money that came through GDUFA and GDUFA 2 funding was personnel hiring. And that personnel hiring expanded the growth of the Office of Generic Drugs from about 100 to 120 people to about 600 people. And they did it in like a 2 to 3 month period. So it was extreme growth over a very short amount of time. And to do that sort of growth, especially at the federal level, you need standard operating procedures. You have to document, and really for any organization, this goes for enterprise as well, you need a strict way of doing something. And we were very much writing these SOPs as we were filling these holes. And so some new classes were doing something that other new classes weren't, and we were trying to paddle the boat and get the water out of it and keep it afloat at the same time. It was a very difficult process. Now, it got done. The GDUFA, depending on who you ask, the GDUFA and the Obamacare or Affordable Care Act, whatever you want to call it, was successful in generating market generics to an acceptable rate. Which, what I mean by that is, prior to the Affordable Care Act, I think it was like 20 to 30% of the market were generic drugs. After the Affordable Care Act, it was about 80, a little more than 80% of the market were generic drugs, which from a access to healthcare and drugs at an affordable rate is a huge success. As someone with a pre-existing condition, I think I have mixed feelings about the Affordable Care Act. I sat pretty close to it, but I do like the access to generic drugs and the access that members now have to a wider array of affordable healthcare. So I think that was a good part. But regardless of how you feel about it politically, the scale of it was, we had the mission from the executive office, so we understood what we wanted to do and where we wanted to get there, where we wanted to get, but we didn't understand how we wanted to get there. And that was the Office of Generic Drugs mission. And sometimes when scale is working faster than you can capture your processes or understand what your processes is or document them out, you run into a lot of hiccups. So I don't think there was as much emphasis put on standard operating procedures at the beginning as there should have been. I joined quality management systems, I think it was like 2015, 16. And we were kind of a hodgepodge group of individuals from various backgrounds that were kind of thrown together to say, hey, help us. We know that we need this and we probably should have done it a while ago, but it is what it is at this point. And so we began the interview process. And at this point, there were already so many people that were being hired on because they were trying to hire on as many individuals as possible to meet the specifications and the agreed upon speculation. What are they? The contractual obligations of GDUFA, because the GDUFA funding from pharmaceutical came with, well, you have to hire this many people, you have to process this many, there were metrics, right? It was a relationship between pharmaceuticals and the federal government to meet this common objective of getting more generics on the market. And so there were hires, lots of them, without standing operating procedures, and then they kind of worked backwards to say, oh crap, we missed the boat here a little bit, let's get this spun up as quickly as possible. So lesson number 3 there, and a very important one, is don't underestimate SOPs and get them written out as soon as possible. When I started my business, actually, when we started Capital Presence, the first thing that I did is I wrote 13 SOPs before we even had a business, before we even totally filed for LC, before we totally agreed upon and signed the paper for our operations agreement. We had SOPs because I had seen what it was to not have them and to try and scale without them, and that simply didn't work. So there are your 3 lessons for the show. Here, this will be the show going forward. And again, this Uncorked was Wild Turkey Kentucky Spirit, which was bottled March 20th, 24. If you do get a chance to give it a whirl, I do highly recommend you guys check out Wild Turkey. And if you want to go on a Bourbon Trail tour, check out our friends at Syndicate Bloodstock. That's syndicatebloodstock.com, where you can actually go on tour and see some of the, which you can come with us, right? We'll go on a bourbon tour. We'll visit Keeneland, the racetrack. I'm wearing a Keeneland hat. We'll see some horse racing, drink some bourbon, talk some business, and have a great time. So guys, thanks for hanging out for the first episode of Uncorked. Check us out at capitalpresence.com. This podcast is available on all major platforms. If you have any questions or topics that you want us to answer, you can reach us on YouTube. Put your question in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe to videos. And until next time, guys, cheers and see ya.